welcome to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. I'm Dino, founder and CEO of Project Purple. We've got an exciting interview coming up with a special guest after a few quick updates. Since 2010, we've contributed over $3 million and counting to pancreatic cancer research efforts. We've also allocated over $1 million worth of aid to more than 1,300 patients and families through our patient aid programs. Your monthly or one-time gift can improve patients' lives through research and assistance programs. You can donate now at projectpurple.org. Pancreatic cancer does not rest, and neither will we. Your support is truly appreciated. If you're looking to get involved in one of our events, whether that means joining a run team, participating in a virtual run walk, group fitness, golf, or anything else you can think of, visit projectpurple.org/events to learn more. Without further ado, let's meet our special guest coming to us from the Big Apple, the founder of Sidious Magazine, Chris Chavez. Welcome to the Project Purple podcast, Chris.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been a fan for a while. I think we were talking offline before we started recording. It's like I remember very fondly 2021 Chicago Marathon I was running, and I remember spotting your cheer zone and the megaphone and everything like that. So you guys always bring a great presence to the races, and so no, thanks for inviting me on.
Well, I'm excited to have you on. I mean, I know before we hit record, we were talking a little bit. I'm going to give you another story. So I know we usually see each other at some point, not like sit and have coffee, but like on the race course. I think it was 20, maybe was it 21 or 22 NYC marathon. You were on the back of the pace, like the camera, but like
yeah, I was on the broadcast in 2022. Yeah.
Yeah, 2022, but you're facing backwards for the 26 miles, right? Like following the leaders, and the camera guy's on the side. You've got like you're in like that it's almost like that I'm trying to think of like the Scooby-Doo analogy where you're in that sidecar, the motorcycle almost, right? Like so that's got to be pretty intense.
It was fun. It was different. Like funny enough, probably the fastest way you can get from Staten Island to Central Park, and on any given day on those same roads because of the road closure and all that stuff. But it was cool. It was a front row seat to watch the elite men's race, and then they tossed it to me 3 or 4 times, I think, during the New York City broadcast on ESPN, and so that was a blast. And then they invited me back on for the 2023 race last year, but last year I actually decided to run the race. So we'll see if I ever get another call back to be part of the broadcast, but it was a lot of fun. And yeah, it was a cool vantage point to watch the whole race unfold.
So really quick on that, did you have to practice like going backwards and like the whole setup and everything, or was it just like, hey Chris, get in the bike, get in the seat, and we're going? Put the strap on?
The day before there was like a dress rehearsal of sorts, and all it was they just had me sit down in the seat, and we didn't even move the little cart. They just kind of repositioned the cameras and checked that my mic was working. And they said, all right, well, we'll do this tomorrow. So they had like a car pick me up in the morning, got on a bus to go to Staten Island. And then once I got all the way out there, that's when, right before the race starts, they strapped me in, and then it was that. So that was my first time ever riding in a vehicle like that. But it was really cool.
That's so awesome. That's so awesome. Well, let's share your background for our listeners and our watchers here. I mean, I might get a little geeked out. Like we were talking before, like running has been so important to me and so important to us here at Project Purple. And you've got to done this amazing thing here with track and field and running. I know we'll talk about track and field, but we'll focus on the marathon since we do a lot of marathons. We don't really do track and field events because there's really not maybe there's a solution. Maybe there's a way to tie in charity into track and field. Maybe by the end of the podcast, we'll figure that out, Chris. But you've done an amazing job of like amplifying, I guess is the best term that I can use right now, is like just putting like track and field, long distance running really on like on a worldwide stage in terms of content. Because before like you decided to do what you were doing, I don't think there was many groups out there. I mean, ESPN, I guess with Moonlight, I know you spent some time at Sports Illustrated. Like there wasn't like any, I mean, I guess you would say Runner's World, but I feel like Runner's World is so broad.
Yeah.
when it came to like marathon content and track and field content. So let's get into your background because I'd love to kind of hear the story firsthand as well.
Yeah. So for me, I guess like my own sort of background with running starts with high school. I was on the high school track team, but I wasn't anything special. I was a sprinter, which is, I think, a surprise to a lot of people, especially now because I've been running marathons, is that my specialty before was the 200 meters. And I didn't run anything all that stellar that would get me Division 1 offers or anything like that, or even any sort of looks from a college. So when I get to college, like that's when sort of I'd finished my high school career and I was only getting better, but not good enough to keep this thing going. So when I get to college, I start running just for health and wellness, just to avoid the freshman 15 and all that stuff. And I watched the New York City Marathon on TV one day. And that's when I decided, I was like, oh, I want to do that someday. Obviously, like you get caught up in sort of like the excitement of it. And for me, it was like my hometown. So I kind of slowly started upping my distance from there, was committed to doing just 5Ks, getting out for like an easy 3 miles here and there, and then just slowly building up my mileage to eventually the following year running my first ever half marathon, seeing how that went and how that felt, and then eventually committing to a marathon for the first time, I think in 2013. I was 19 years old and I ran my first ever one, and it was like 4 hours and like 18 minutes or 17 minutes or something like that. My goal had been to break 4, and I fell apart like most people do in their first marathon. And yeah, so from there, like that's when I caught the marathon bug. And at the same time, it's tied perfectly to when I started kind of familiarizing myself with a bit more of like the track and field professional landscape, where I think for a long time in 2000, like around 2012, there was another Olympics rolling around, and that was the year that it was going to be in London. And it was a time when a lot of people just kind of knew Usain Bolt, and that was it. Like that was the track star that everyone knew. Maybe Allison Felix as well. But beyond that, like no one really knew who else was kind of competing at these events. And I kind of wanted to take it upon myself to educate myself and reverse engineer myself as a track and field fan. So that's when I started, going back and watching old YouTube videos, reading old Sports Illustrated stories on like what essentially the history of track and like what makes these athletes special. And I was also kind of carving out like an idea in my head of like what I want to do in my career. I was a sports journalism major at Marquette University, and I was thinking like, the dream was ultimately to be, I was a big baseball fan growing up, to be like the New York Yankees beat writer. Like that'd be such an amazing job. But then you think more and more about it, like there's only so many people who hold that job, and you got to put in your time, like at a small newspaper somewhere and get your reporting chops, and then move on to like a medium-sized newspaper or whatever it might be. And it takes a while to really establish yourself. But then I also was thinking, it's like there's no one doing this in track, and like you get the opportunity to go to the Olympics, like that's like the big stage. Every sport has their big thing, whether it's the World Series or the Super Bowl, and the Olympics is really appealing. And so that's when I started to think like I could really be the Adam Schefter or the Adrian Wojnarowski of telling these athletes stories and breaking news and all that stuff. And so there really wasn't that, anyone doing that in professional track at the time. And so by establishing relationships with athletes and coaches and agents and going to the events, and, that kind of really helped me when I started doing it in 2012 with, Flow Track at the time. And, now they're huge, media company. But that's where sort of I got my start within the running space. And at the same time, I'm getting into my own sort of running. So it's always been a cool combination of being able to speak to the sport that I'm covering and having that relatability with the athletes. Yeah, they're a lot faster than me, but there's something to being able to, talk about my goal of chasing a sub 3 hour marathon and relating it to an athlete trying to break 4 minutes for the mile for the first time. Like we both can understand, the amount of hard work it takes to chase a goal and see what your own sort of personal limits are. And so, for me, like kind of assessing, the media landscape, like that was still, I kind of stuck to the plan as like keep doing it in track. And when I finally did graduate college, like there was an opportunity to work at Sports Illustrated, and I took that in 2015, and I saw that as like the first big year for me to really prove to my bosses there that I was the track guy and I deserved to be part of like the Sports Illustrated Olympic team come 2016 in Rio. And then that was a dream come true. Got to go cover the Olympics there for the first time, and it was amazing. And then sort of it kind of does sort of kick off another period of my life in 2000, the fall of 2016 of like, okay, now what's next? And when that happened, I realized it's like, oh, like these big sports media places don't really care about a sport like track outside of like the Olympic year as much as they do in an actual Olympic year. So, but I still have a passion for it, and I needed to create my own place to get that outlet and that, sort of, scratch that itch of being able to continue doing the track and field and marathon, storytelling that I'd wanted to, and that I'd done for the 4 years before that previous Olympics. And so, that's when Sidious Mag came about. And, what started off as a passion project on the side quickly developed into like a little bit of a business. And by the time 2021 rolled around and another Olympic cycle had passed, that is, coupled with the pandemic, when you start to kind of reassess how things are going. And I decided at the end of 2021 I was going to leave Sports Illustrated and do Sidious Mag full time. And now we're 3 years into this whole thing, and it's been great to have like the support of all the major sportswear and footwear brands, and they recognize the importance of what we do when it comes to telling those athlete stories and hyping up, the big events. And then on the same side, like the athletes love that we present like this fresh and different voice in the space that is on their side all the time. And so that's been super cool. And at the same time, like I'm like a business owner and like have to, kind of run a media company now, which is a little different than having just been a writer and editor at SI for 6.5 years. But so I'm learning a lot, and at the same time, still having a lot of fun when it comes to doing my job. There's not a day that isn't like, there hasn't been a day that I feel like is boring. And that's just always the rewarding feeling and what everyone can kind of chase when it comes to like what they want to do in life. So yeah, it's been really cool. And so that's the Spark Notes, I think, version of just like the last 10 years or so.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, first question here. Do you consider yourself an entrepreneur? I'm sure maybe you've been asked this question before or thought about it. Like, did you have like a paper route when you were little, or, when you were in high school or something, where you're like always hustling?
That's a great question. And actually, like, it has taken some time, I guess, for me to like really put myself in sort of like that entrepreneur bucket. Cause I've, for the longest time, was just sort of like always somewhat like an employee, like, or like at Sports Illustrated, I started off as a fellow for a year, and like having to prove myself that like bring me on full time. And then from there, like I was part of like the breaking news team, and I, did my job really well enough to get, moved up to overseeing the whole team and being an editor. And so like, yeah, it was interesting because when I did choose to leave, like that was the first time I'd ever been sort of like, now I'm in a position to like, I'm the boss. And I am responsible for, how much money we're bringing in and what else, how we're going to continue growing and strategizing around that kind of stuff. So it has been, fun. And yeah, it took a while for me to really kind of recognize and be like, I'm an entrepreneur, and like, this is a small business we got going on, but like, there's, signs that it could be something bigger down the road.
Yeah, and there's nothing like that's a compliment. Like being an entrepreneur, I think like, and the reason why I asked the question is because like you had like Sports Illustrated is the top of the food chain, right? Like you left the top of the food chain to go and do something on your own, which you're super passionate about. But I always say like passion will always prevail. If you have passion and you love what you do, which you said, like it's just so awesome, then like all that other stuff, like yeah, there is running a business, and there's tough times, and there's no 9 to 5 when you run your own business. But if you
Hmm.
have that passion and you're able to like continue to have that and continue to do great things, like it'll all work out. But for someone who, isn't an entrepreneur that, like you said, like you're always trying to prove yourself or you're at SI and you're just coming in, your job is to write content and be really good at writing content. Sometimes it's hard to like look outside and be like, okay, I could do this on my own and I can make this happen and build this, empire of marketing for track and field.
Yeah, and it is interesting when I kind of go back and think of like I'm super thankful for everything that I learned while I was at Sports Illustrated because it's been super valuable to being able to command a team now. But yeah, it was a little daunting at the very beginning. I'm like, all right, this is going to be a risk. Having left a big company like Sports Illustrated, but yeah, like over time, as you're learning, you're also getting a lot of support from different people and trading insights on like here's what I learned or asking questions. Like that's always kind of been the key to getting through it so far.
Was there a tipping point is a term I use often, and was there a tipping point that you've seen so far in the small history of Sidious that you've seen kind of like, hey, like the light bulb, like maybe a light bulb moment too, like wow, like we're on to something here, like like the numbers have exploded, or like people are really like the followers, and the content is just like this, it becomes like this little funnel and then it just explodes out. Like, have you seen that yet, Chris, with what you guys are doing?
Yeah, 2021 Olympics in Tokyo was a big turning point because at that point, my friend Kyle Merber had retired from professional track and field, where he was, a distance runner for 10 years. And he was looking for his next step. And he launched a newsletter and it was doing really well. And at the same time, we have just like a great relationship as friends. And then, we podcasted daily during the Olympic trials and during the Olympics and the reception to all of that was great. Him having brought the experience of being an athlete for that long, and me on the reporter journalist side for a long time. When you kind of mesh both of those experiences, it brings a very different level of insight to the sport than what you get maybe from on TV or even like there really wasn't a whole lot of that out there, and so by doing the podcast daily during both the Olympic trials and the Olympics, like we looked at the numbers and, we were among the top podcasts on all of Apple Podcasts and in the sports category and on Spotify. And so that was like, whoa, like we're breaking through here and we're just like this little startup side project thing versus like looking at all the different shows around us. It's like, shows from ESPN and the Barstool Network and all that stuff. And I'm like, we're just passionate track fans and look at where we're like the company that we're keeping here. And so then that kind of did set off sort of a little bit of a light bulb in my head where I was thinking, okay, my time at SI, like I kind of had hit the ceiling on like where I was at that point. I didn't get to go to the Tokyo Olympics, like just sort of the credential situation. They cut down on those numbers and I was kind of left off the team because of COVID. And then I was thinking more about it. I was like, well, this is going really well. And this is just like a side project and it's bringing in money. We're attracting sponsors. Like there's something good here that at the end of 2021, I just took mental inventory of like, all right, some big things are coming up in track over the next couple of years. Like the World Championships were coming to the United States for the first time in 2022. And at that point, like I knew SI wasn't going to send me to that. I would have to pay for it out of my own pocket and so once that started to be the case, I was like, instead of just, burning PTO and then still going out to work, like, I'm just going to do this for myself. And Kyle was on board from the very beginning. And so, from that point on, we brought on someone to help oversee some of our video initiatives. And so that's when sort of like 2022 was the beginning of this new chapter. Yes, Sidious Mag has been around since 2017 in some way, shape, or form, but 2022 was when it took on this sort of new form. And I think a point when people could look at it and be like, oh, they're serious. Like they're going to be around for a bit and like they're only going to level up. And so that was the big turning point for sure. And since then, like the momentum has just kind of carried on. Like we're just seeing year over year growth across like all of our different channels. The following, it's like continuing to grow in waves, especially around big events. Like we're coming off of the Paris Olympics, and that was huge for us. We had nearly 200 million impressions across like all of our social channels, which is just like this crazy reach that I would have never like thought of. And I don't think I would have been capable of if I was still juggling my 9 to 5 at Sports Illustrated. And so for that to have been possible, like, yeah, I mean, it did take me kind of going all in. Cause now if you think about it, like I wasn't taking that 9 to 5 job where I'm like balancing, essentially during the pandemic, I had 2 laptops open at all times. I had my Sports Illustrated stuff going on, but then I was starting to do a little bit more for Sidious. And that was just kind of like one of the benefits of being able to work remotely. But so I was like, all right, if you shut that other laptop down and now we're fully committing to just doing Sidious, then like, obviously the output is going to be bigger. And that's been the case. And and now especially kind of growing the team has led to even more of that. So we're still not like a ESPN or anything like that, where we're producing 100 or 50 pieces of content a day. Sometimes it's a day where there's like 3 or 4 new things, but it's all quality stuff. And like, we'll find a way to re-promote it across all of our different channels and for people to consume in the different places that people consume media. I think that's been the one strength that I've had from like my time at Sports Illustrated, is I have an understanding of how people, consume news nowadays. And yeah, at the heart of it, like Sports Illustrated is a magazine where you get long form, amazing reported stories. But I fully understand that like most people nowadays aren't sitting down to read 5,000 words. And I think that there's, even the concept of an article on a website, sometimes I go back and forth on it. It's like, is it worth spending time writing a 200-word article for a website? Or you just have a really thorough Instagram caption that is just as long and has bigger reach, because people will be sharing this thing much easier than if it was, copying, pasting the link and texting it to a friend or whatever it is, or finding it on social media. I think that social media has definitely changed the game, and being at the top of it while growing up with all of it. Like, it's not something I didn't go to class to learn how people are doing this stuff. It's just sort of like, I'm 30 years old and like I grew up with all these different tools, and I'm kind of always paying attention to how people are doing things nowadays. And so, TikTok is still something that is a little foreign to me, but that's, I think, a lot of people.
We're all trying to figure that one out, Chris.
Everyone's trying to figure it out. But, that's also the importance of being able to have young people around you, the college kids who can make a TikTok video so much better than I could spend 2 hours on or whatever it is. And so that's kind of always important, is having my finger on the pulse of how people consume media.
How big is your staff now? I know you've mentioned some names. So like, I know you had a pretty big crew at the Olympics just from the coverage that I saw, but
yeah, so it's still, behind the scenes, like there's still only like 2 or 3 of us full time. And then from there, like we've got a bunch of people just contracted. Some of our people like are in this position that I was in a few years ago, where it's like, for them, the track stuff is fun and like it's just for fun. And it, we pay them well, that like, it's just a nice little side hustle they've got going on while they still also balance like a full-time job. And that's been really cool. Because it's like, I don't necessarily think that the media landscape specifically within track is out there just quite yet for there to be just sort of like, hey, like I'm going to cover track and field full time and just be a social media editor for it. Like, it's still got a ways to go. Like, we're definitely still in that startup mode, but hopefully in due time, like, it's like, all right, like, again, to the point of like, if you shed someone's, 9 to 5 and they can fully commit to doing this thing full time, then, who knows just how much more we could be doing.
Well, yeah. And you guys put out a ton of great content. I mean, just, I was following along during the Olympics, and now like, hey, we're post Olympics, right? And yesterday was a pretty busy day. As we record this, right? Like, you had the Northern Arizona coach, like that announcement. Then you had Mondo breaking the world record again, and you guys were all over this stuff. So there's a lot going on for 2 to 3 people. And, I think as an entrepreneur, like, scaling's the biggest challenge, right? Like, employment is like your biggest expense of any business, regardless whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit marketing, so that's the trick, right? Like, that is the trick of how to balance all that. Question for you though, here, staying in track and field. Why do you think? I mean, there are so many great stories, and you guys were on, like Mondo, for example, right? This pole
Yeah.
vaulter that has like set like the last 10 world records. Now just sit with him on this. Why do you think there's such a hesitance to like talk about these guys outside of these Olympic cycles?
Yeah,
Like
it's interesting.
sports media, like because like this guy's doing like that, that is at like it, it's insane, man. Like
Yeah.
that's not like human. Like it's epic. It's epic
It's
stuff, right? Like I mean, if you really break it down in a track and field sense, like what he's been able to do is like amazing. Like it's a once in like we're witnessing history, and we may not ever see this ever again.
yeah, and it's like the big deal I think this past weekend was like three guys being able to clear 6 meters in the pole vault, but then at the same time, like Mondo wins by like 0.25, 0.26. He's still winning by a lot. And what these other guys did is very impressive. It's hard. And like, that is the biggest challenge. That's like, that is the battle that we face is like, how do we get this to break through into the mainstream sports media outside of like the Olympics for, those 3 weeks in Paris, like all of these athletes are, captivating and people love it. Like it was super awesome to open up Twitter and then, during the Olympics and see everyone going crazy over Mondo breaking the world record at the
Yeah,
Olympics. And I would say that there's a fraction of that fan, like those people who saw that and were hyped up about it that are even aware that this happened this past weekend, that he went even higher and broke his own world record. But that's the challenge of the sport is the Olympics is the pinnacle and people will, tune out as soon as it's over. And it's not easy to be a track fan. Like, and that's why it's at the heart of our mission statement. That if people went on our website, it's like, what are we all about? Like, and on our about page, like it's at the very top of it. It's like, make it easier and more fun to be a track
yeah,
fan because the follow through post Olympics is what's important. And, I just don't think that the major stakeholders like an NBC, they do a great job during the actual Olympics of broadcasting this stuff and bringing you all these moments and pushing all of the content. And they paid a lot of money, to the IOC to be able to own all of that stuff. But they're not necessarily responsible for what comes next. And what comes next falls into like a whole other fractured bucket of stakeholders where it's sort of like you got this group that owns this, series of meets and they've got it behind a paywall here, and this group that owns this stuff, and that's behind that paywall, and no one's really, telling you got to watch this here or that there. But that's our position. It's like, well, we come to it from a very agnostic position of trying to tell people, hey, like you really loved, watching Gabby Thomas during the Olympics compete in the 200. Well, here's when the next time you could see her, where you could see her, how you could see her, and why, what's at stake this time around, and like really kind of feed it to them in as simple as possible. And there just isn't like, from the major, kind of, uh, I would say like the NBCs, they're not doing that,
yeah.
after the Olympics. And ESPN doesn't get involved because they don't own any of, the Olympics. It's like, why should they, kind of prop up, a sport that they
NBC's
can't
product,
even
yeah,
show the best of every 4 years. And so that's why it's sort of like ESPN does a great job when it comes to like the New York City Marathon or the cross country championships because they have the rights to that stuff, and so they'll do some lead up to that stuff, not anything major. So that's the hardest part is that the major stakeholders all have different priorities, and so for like NBC, it's the Olympics and the Paralympics, but not necessarily what happens in the years in between. And they don't have the rights to all of the stuff that takes place in between. This group owns it or that group owns it. And that group's not going to tell you what's on that other stuff. And so that's where we come in. And our mission is, try and make it as easy as possible. And sometimes that is, kind of hand holding and pointing people in the right direction of like, hey, like, and I always tell people like, the easiest way to start to try and become a track fan is following us on Instagram, or on Twitter, whatever it might be that most people are at, because like that's where sort of like there is no sports center account for track and field or for running, but we're the closest thing to that because we'll find a way to give you the hard hitting news that's out there, like the major stuff, and with ample context and pointing you into like, hey, like this is coming up or that's coming up or this just happened. I think at the end of the day, most people don't even realize that like these world record setting performances happen. Like few people tune in and watch it actually live. Most people will find out about it from an Instagram graphic
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I know just from being involved in the sport, I would say from like running, right? And not necessarily track and field, but like, there's the Diamond League. Now there's this, Michael Johnson is supposedly putting a league together. And hearing you speak, I mean, like there's these tremendous feats that happen at these events, right? But you don't see them. I think the Diamond League was on maybe Paramount or NBC Plus or one of those.
Yeah, the Diamond League is on it's on Peacock. Yeah.
Yeah, Peacock. Okay, yeah. But like again, like you wouldn't really know unless you were looking for it, right? And it's almost wild. I mean, since I got into, running, as a personal thing here, it always marveled me like the premier athletes, like the professional athletes. And we put, I think our society here in the United States, and I think I'll call ESPN out because they're the worldwide leader, as that's what they're called, right? For like basketball and baseball and football, like they prop these athletes up. And I wonder if we did the same, because I think some of these track and field and these endurance athletes, I've been around some of them. I mean, it is insane. I don't think the average person realizes like what these athletes do to their bodies, to their discipline, and just getting to the start line, right? Like in the effort and energy that they put in. And I'm not knocking like other professional athletes, but like, hey, NBA has an off season, MLB has an off season, but I put money on it. So here I am. I put a bet. I bet you track and field athletes do a harder training than MLB and NFL and NBA, like through the whole year.
For
Like if you
sure.
look at the whole year. But as a society, we have this like weird way of like, taking like, Tom Brady and like he's the GOAT, right? But then if you look at track and field, like there's been like Mondo, right? Like this dude's a GOAT, man. But no one, unless you're
Yeah.
in the know, like you don't know about him, right? Or like, some of these runners, like an Allison Felix. I mean, like some of them do tip into mainstream every now and then, but like to your point, it's during the Olympics, but like
Hmm.
they're training for 4 years, like so disciplined, and that training is so difficult. Like it's just wild how, and I would think from a storytelling standpoint, like the networks would be like that would be like a home run sell. But what do I know, Chris? I'm
Yeah.
not in that marketing end, and I'm sure they're a lot smarter than us, I guess, or me, I should say. But it's just
Yeah, because you
wild to
raise a
me.
great point. Like the day to day, essentially, like at some point in the MLB season, like these guys aren't like doing a rigorous practice every single day,
Oh,
especially when you got 162 games lined up. Like
correct.
most of it is just routine at that point. It's like
Exactly.
their ability to hit and or pitch or whatever it is at that point is just like it's just routine to them. Like there's not like a track and field athlete every single day is a grueling day at the track. And
Yeah.
when you're not, out there training, you're doing as much as you can to recover,
Cover.
to be ready for that next run or that next, workout. So yeah, I mean, I don't for sure think that there's as much of an appreciation for the level that it takes and that commitment every single day for these athletes.
Yeah, it's wild. Well, that's why, for our watchers and listeners, this is why reason number one, and we're going to share many to follow Sidious on social and wherever you are, to stay up to date on some of these great stories because you guys do put out some amazing content. Let's shift gears here. I want to talk a little bit about your own personal accomplishments because you have run quite a few marathons. Um, What's kind of been your favorite marathon? And I'm going to stay in the marathon space because I think
Yeah.
a lot of our listeners and watchers can probably relate to the marathon space. But I know you've run quite a few. I know we talked a little bit about Paris. But what's been kind of your favorite marathon?
So I've done all the six majors. So I can speak to that. And like, it's always hard because I get asked, it's like, which one's your favorite of the
Put you on the
six?
spot, Chris.
But the easiest one, that's an easy question for me because it's like I'll always pick New York.
Of course.
That day is the best in the city. The atmosphere is unmatched. The course is grueling. So it's like it's not necessarily the race that you run for a time. I tried that and it backfired on me big time. If you do want sort of like the really fast and like great vibes, I loved Berlin. Berlin's awesome. That's where sort of my PR was before. I ran the Houston Marathon, and I've gone back and run that race twice. Tokyo is also great because they've got a great appreciation for long distance running. But yeah, so it's like my favorite race is always going to be the New York City Marathon. But then also just like personal sort of accomplishment, running the Houston Marathon this year and breaking 3 hours for the first time. It's going to be hard to top that, I think. Like I don't have any other big marathon goals now. Like that was it, and to do it on that day was mission accomplished, and also a decade long chase, I would say. Yeah.
And your personal running, so you're training, you're out running 4 or 5 days a week. Like you're in, what would you say? Like I know you just came off Paris where you ran that marathon, but like in normal like off season, Chris Chavez, are you like in half marathon shape, or are you just 5K shape, or where are you?
Yeah, it's some sort of mix. Like I always try and stay within like a decent half marathon shape. Like I am part of like a team here in New York City, the Central Park Track Club, and so there's workouts, twice a week that you can attend, and then long runs on Saturdays. So there's just I prefer running with a group, even if it's for like easy miles. Like it just makes the time pass so much easier. I Yeah, so I think like for the most part, I run between like 25 to 30 miles on a normal week. And then during marathon training, it did ramp up to the point where I was like in the 50s, and I think I touched 60 once. But yeah, I think I'm not one of those people that really stresses over, a very strict sort of calendar, especially with work. Like I get really busy sometimes, and there'll be weeks when I'm like, all right, it was a 17-mile week, and that's fine. And that's okay with me. So, I like keeping it fairly loose. The best thing for me is always a 4 mile run. Leave the door, go out, knock it out in 30 minutes or so, and come back home, and then you get the same dry, dose of endorphins.
Yeah.
And that's always great for me. So I love a good 4 mile run.
You think you ever step up to like an ultra?
No, I don't think I'll ever do an ultra. Like it's just sort of the training for it. I marathon is enough for me. I've done like a couple bigger runs. Like I did the Goggins challenge back in 2021. And so that was 48 miles in 48 hours. That was painful. I did the speed project from LA to Vegas, and I think I did 52, 53 miles in that. And we did that in like 38, 40 hours or so. So yeah, I think I've gotten my dose of just sort of like the super long stuff, and I'm not as suited for it. So for me, like I find a great half marathon in a destination location, and pick a couple friends to convince to do it. Like that sounds like the perfect trip.
Love it. Um, Person alive or deceased who you would want to run a couple miles with? Who would that be?
That's a great question. I think like for me, it goes back to just sort of being like a childhood Yankee fan of like, Derek Jeter is my pick. Like having been around so many of these like Olympic gold medalists and like world record holders, I don't, and like interviewed even Usain Bolt one on one, like nothing I think would ever, like I've never really gotten all that nervous around like a running or track and field person. But I think like to this day, the only person I'd get nervous around would be Derek Jeter. Just because like that was my hero, like growing up, watching. He brought so much joy to my life, leading the Yankees to all of those World Series titles. So it'd be him, and like it'd be like the dream scenario would be like a 4 mile run with Derek Jeter in Central Park. That would be it.
It's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Um, where do you see yourself in 5 years with Sidious? And like, if we had a crystal ball here, and like, hey, the crystal ball is going to tell us our future, what would that be, Chris?
Yeah, 5 years. So that puts us through the next Olympic cycle. So that's through LA. Um, Yeah, it's interesting because I've never taken on any sort of like investor money and like been just doing this thing that at that point, like probably have uh done a little bit more of that. And then we've grown maybe like 2029, 2028 is around the time like I'd consider sort of selling some part of Sidious. If like, I don't know, like that'd be, we'll see where it continues to grow. But I do see 2028 as a very pivotal time for both Sidious and also just track and field with the Olympics coming to LA. So that's going to be a big kind of milestone. And we've got just sort of like all the great stars right now within the sport. Like we were at a time when it was, Usain Bolt, and he was the star. We had one star in the sport that commanded everyone's attention. And nowadays, like, you've mentioned Mondo multiple times, but if you're a 100-meter guy, then like maybe it's Noah Lyles, or if it's a 200 meters, then it's like Gabby Thomas. And all of these athletes have great personalities, and are out there, that it's in a healthier place now where we're not just sort of relying on one person to get everyone's attention. You can come at the sport from all of these different places. And so continuing to be at the forefront of storytelling around those people and having close ties to them is going to be, kind of our goal. There was just a 16-year-old who won an Olympic gold medal for
Quincy.
Team USA, Quincy
Yeah.
Wilson. And like
Yeah. Great
on the
story.
on the back end of things, like we've been covering Quincy since he had 2,000 Instagram followers and was like a sophomore in high school. And I have a picture of like the first ever interview I did with him. And, at that point it was like no one had ever really kind of interviewed this kid. And now like he's blown up. He's got, over 250,000 followers on Instagram, and he was taking pictures with LeBron and getting all the attention on the broadcast. ESPN is posting highlight clips of when he used to play football. And we were at the ground floor with someone like Quincy Wilson. And so it's like, how many more Quincy Wilsons can we find and be, kind of at that, beginning stage? Because he's someone who like, is going to remember that. It's like, oh yeah, I'll always talk to Sidious because like they were always there. They were there for me when I was a high school sophomore, and like no one had seen, any of what would be possible. So that'll be cool. Is just continuing to grow with that. And so, yeah, that's what I'm particularly excited about with Sidious, is that between now and LA, like, there's so much momentum coming off of these Paris Olympics. It's the workhorse in me that doesn't want to take the foot off the gas.
Yeah, well, you must be on this high, right? Like this is like this, you come off this huge high, and now it's like, all right, what's that next thing? Like, what's that next event? I know for us, like we come off New York and we're like, all right, like we're all so jazzed. Or like Chicago, like Chicago's not bad because we go into New York, but then New
Yeah.
York, you're like, oh shit, like we got to wait a year now, or we got to wait to April for Boston, to get back on that high. So something that just came up. So you mentioned Quincy, and yeah, they're like I just my youngest son just graduated high school last year. Now we've got him in college, and so playing high school sports and knowing like track and field, like cross country and track, and he was involved in like I've seen locally here in Connecticut some kids over the last both my boys were actually invested in track and field through the whole year, through cross country and then through indoor outdoor. And there's been some amazing performances here in New England. And I do feel like there is kind of like a youth movement coming through. So how do you manage that then? Like, like you're trying to get, like you said, Quincy, you got him early. Like, do you have like a whiteboard with just names of people that like, hey, we're tracking these folks, like if they're going to pop or like they're interesting stories, get them on, Sidious for the pod or to do an interview?
No, this is a great question. And I think like it at the heart of it is like we have a fantastic relationship with New Balance, and they put on like the high school national
Yeah.
championship. It's New Balance Nationals, and every kid wants to compete at that thing from when they're like, a high school freshman or sophomore, because, that's when you get your glimpses of like who's next, who's the next big star. And, all the college coaches are at that meet, and, it's a big opportunity to pop off on a national stage. And when we came into it, we've done it 3 years now of being at their national championships. It's very cool because the way we've worked with New Balance has been, it's sort of like they bring on their pro athletes to come and, take pictures with the kids and hype things up. And then we're there to actually cover the meet and, bring our spotlight to them as well. And we would do interviews where like the professional athletes would, sit down with us, and also we'd bring in like the high school athletes, and that you could tell like they're fawning over the fact that they're about to get interviewed by Emma Coburn or Trayvon
Yeah.
Brumell or whoever it might be. And the coolest part is that then there's a picture sort of that, that is a snapshot that you have of this moment in time when this kid is, a high school junior or senior or whatever it might be. And they have that moment with that pro athlete. And then we look, fast forward like 3 years now, some of these kids are winning NCAA titles. Like Juliet Whitaker was someone, was a high school 800-meter star that we sat down with back in 3 years ago. And she just made the Olympic team and made the semifinals of like the 800. And so we've familiarized ourselves with these high school athletes when we cover them at, New Balance Nationals. And also just sort of like, for me strategically, from, me sitting at the top of Sidious and how we go about just audience building and where we want to take things, for the longest time, I think like, and this is a battle every major shoe company has been facing for decades now. It's just sort of like, how do we get the backpack marathoners to care about, what's happening at the front end? And it is a battle, and those are very important demographics. And I'm sure a lot of those people are also the people listening to this right now. It's like, I never really cared or paid attention to like, who ultimately wins the New York City Marathon or the Chicago Marathon. Like a lot of people are there for their own sort of personal experience and maybe learning at the post-race party about like, oh, who won the race? It was like, oh, this Kenyan guy in 204, 208, whatever it might
Yeah.
be. Like it's all the same to them. That person could have ran 212,
Yeah.
202, and that like, and that's fine. But like, I think like if, creating that sort of awareness as to like who those people at the front end of the race, it is hard. But I think like the biggest demographic that I try and really focus a lot more of our efforts is in the high school population. Like those are young kids who are just learning about the sport and they're actively involved in it. And they care so much about their contemporaries. Like the reason Quincy Wilson does these massive mega numbers is because every high school kid in the country can see themselves and can relate. It's like, hey, I run a 400 in 70 seconds and you're telling me this kid does it in 44 seconds. That's sort of where their mind gets blown. And so they are aware of who the fellow high school stars are. The challenge is always the drop off after these kids stop competing at the high school level.
Yeah.
It's like, once they get to college, like, are they still going to care about like, what's happening in track and field? Maybe they'll still be aware of who Quincy Wilson is, but how do you make sure that they follow along as Quincy goes off to win NCAA titles and makes another Olympic team or whatever it might be, if he turns pro or whatnot? Like that is the challenge. But I see that the population is bigger there with social media. Like it's easier to bridge that gap and connect people. So yeah, it's two big major buckets of potential fans is how I view it. It's the high school population, and then it's your everyday runner. And that everyday runner is I think harder to crack than the high school kids, because the high school kids, they can relate. But the marathoners, everyday marathoners and half marathoners, to get them to understand just like how crazy a 12:35 5K is harder than, trying to tell that to a high school kid. So yeah, I mean, that's how kind of like we go about, assessing like where we put our efforts towards with the high school and college demographics.
It's fascinating. And I agree with you. Yeah. Cause it's hard. Like, I think like, yeah, my kids, like they didn't run. Like I would talk to my kids about half marathons and marathons. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like they can't, it's unrelatable. But 800, like my older son ran the 800, he ran the 400, he was on the 4x400 team, so like easy to relate and knowing like who's in that sphere and who's in that space. I got one last question for you, and then we're going to share where the best place is for people to follow along as you go on this journey. And this is a little bit of a loaded question, and there's no right or wrong to this, Chris, but given your opinion, what's been the biggest story that you've covered since you started Sidious? Like, and I guess I'll start there, and then I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. Yeah, biggest story that we've covered. I mean, it's so hard because it's like I view it in like events and like where we've been to. It's like this Paris Olympics was huge for us. And it was our first Olympics that we'd ever been credentialed for. And that was a rewarding feeling, is having the credential around my neck that said
You're
like Citius
legit.
Mag.
Yeah.
That, yeah, it was like a sign. I was like, oh, we made it. Um,
Did you go over
so
to
I think
the
like in
SI
general,
booth? Did you go
what's
over to the
that?
SI? Did you go over to the SI guys and like wave it in front of
It's
them?
funny. I did go. I went to like the SI like office that they had like in the Paris Media Center, and like it was cool to see the people I work with, the handful that are left there, but people I was at the 2016 Olympics with, and like kind of updating them like, yeah, here's what I've been up to, and they're like, oh, we've been paying attention, and they've been like super supportive of it all. But yeah, so I think like for thinking out loud, yeah, it's probably like the Paris Olympics this year, and just sort of like the full court press that we kind of put on track for those 2 weeks. It was like we had a big team in Paris that we were producing like our own sort of, live content around. But then at the same time, we had people in the States who were, running our social channels and all that kind of stuff. And they crushed it. And they did, a lot of the heavy lifting when it came to just like, hey, when we're going to bed in Paris at 2 a.m., like that's still sort of primetime hours in the United States. So it's like, for me as the boss, like I have to be trusting of like that team and be like, all right, like, when I wake up in the morning, it's like I'm going to see what you guys posted on Instagram, and so one, I hope it's right, and I hope it's all presented super well and all that
No
stuff. So,
pressure, Chris. No
uh,
pressure there.
yeah, and like that's just kind of been a growing, a part of growing too, just personally, is like we're growing, and like I can't be in control of every single thing as much as I used to be. Like I think one of the most rewarding parts is during the Paris Olympics, like I we're doing so much as the meet is happening, and I'm taking care of like other stuff live inside the stadium, that I don't see what our Instagram looks like live in real time. Like it's at the end of the night, once we're all done with things and the final podcast is recorded and posted, that's when like I'm getting ready for bed and I can open up Instagram and see like, whoa, like, wow, like we did all of this stuff. And like it all looks clean, and people are, buzzing off in the comments section, and the likes are pouring in, and the athletes and the fans are sharing things. And it's like, wow, it's like, all right, we got something really special here. And it does take a team to pull it all off. And so, for me, that's been sort of like rewarding, is to take a step back at the end of the Olympics and be like, well, like we've got a well-oiled machine going right now. And like, I just want to keep it going, and honestly, just like do more, bring on more people that can help out, and scope out that talent, that could be good matches for it. So, um, that's the competitive side in me too. I think that at the end of the day, it's like you just want to keep getting better and better. And it's like, even though we're probably the ones doing the best, when it comes to just sort of like engagement and just reach and all that stuff, when on the track and field media side, like I still view us as small, like in the greater sports landscape. And it's like, I want to get closer to the next, niche passion driven sport, and try and overtake that. Yeah.
It's awesome. Um, I think your picture from the volleyball venue with the tower in the background, when you posted that, I was like, oh my God, man, that like should be on a poster, and you should be selling that for like 9.99. Like that was killer. I mean, you guys had some great content from the Olympics, and I'm not one for TV. I thought it was kind of it was great because you guys were posting content, but by the time like the TV coverage rolled around, I'm like, I already know the results. Like,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
follow
That's,
these guys, and like my wife, like, and I don't really watch a lot of TV. I just don't have a lot of time for it. But yeah, it was awesome. Second part of that question, and my last question, I promise. What's been your favorite story to cover? Like something that maybe was like really personal, or something that you enjoyed the most, may not have been the most outreach, but something that was like really fulfilling for you personally.
yeah. Um, I guess like it's fun because at the heart of like, doing the podcast that I did, the CDS Mag podcast every week, like I just, for me, that's my medium to be able to like have great conversations and share these stories pretty widely. Great listenership and audience base that like is receptive to anyone that we chat to. And there's times when it's sort of like I veer off from covering the professional side of the sport, and it's choosing to highlight more, personal stories that are out there. And so like, I go back to, and this is a very fond one that I think about is Mario Diurno, who goes by like the Italian Horn on Instagram. Like he was one of the guys involved pretty heavily within Release Recovery, a charity that
Mhm.
I've, fundraised for, and I'm super tight with like the founder of, and it was a recovery story, someone who'd gone through addiction and substance abuse and, their own sort of like depression. And, it was before that, I think the New York City, it was after the New York City Marathon, in fact, because he was he was the second to last guy who finished the race. And so it's like for a moment, like I hit pause on highlighting like the winners and like the top Americans and all that stuff. And it's like, all right, let me talk to Mario and share his story on there. And it was touching and honest and raw. And I appreciate sort of that candor that he brought to it. And the audience loves it. And that's kind of expected because it's a great story. But then it's sort of like the dominoes that fall after that is where it starts to kind of blow my mind sometimes, where it's like after that podcast, it was like one girl listened to that show and reached out to Zach Clark from Release Recovery about any sort of like job opportunities or like being able to help out there because she'd become aware of what release was. And now she's like heavily involved in the foundation and helping run things on a day to day, working closely with the charity team that they have to get all these bibs for these races. And it was, I think, at the heart of it because she'd listened to the podcast and became aware of, what Mario's story was and how he's connected to all of it. And realizing, I think, just sort of like the reach of what just what the podcast is Insidious sometimes kind of does still blow my mind. So that's like a very cool example because now through the work that she's gone on to do, I'm sure it's gone on to raise a lot of money for the charity
Mhm.
and, get these scholarships for people who need it and, save some lives. And it is crazy to kind of connect the dots behind the scenes of like, whoa, like if you really kind of trace it back, it's because you listen to this running podcast. Like that's wild. So yeah, I think like it's instances like that, to this day, sometimes I just think like, oh, I'm just covering track and field, but there are those moments that happen too.
It's the power, man. And then something you said, I'm going to go back to and close this is like the passion you have for what you do is really genuine. And when you have passion, you can do great things. And you may see it as like, man, we're promoting track and field and we're making it really fun, but you're impacting people in such a positive way. And, that's something that I'm always inspired by. There's so many great causes and so many, there's so much help that needs to be done with everything in our society, right? But if we have more people like yourself, taking something and having passion around it and then running literally and figuratively with that to open up the funnel, right? To get more people aware of these things that are happening that are amazing. It's just really, really special. So thanks for the time that you've given us here on the podcast. And thanks for all you're doing for track and field. I love your content. I wasn't, my kids ran track and field for 4 years, so I knew a little bit about it, but following you guys along over the last couple of months has been awesome. You guys, like you say, have a lot of fun with it and highlight some really, really great stories. There's so many. I'm not going to mention any athletes because there's so many cool stories. I know we mentioned Mondo and Quincy, but there's Ellie St. Pierre. There's the marathon. Cole Hacker. Nikki Hiltz. I mean, there's like some wild, great, and I say wild in a very positive way. There's some amazing stories, and you guys have been at the front lines, like telling those. So, thank you for all you're doing, Chris, and I hope to see. Are you going to be in Chicago? Where are you going to be this fall?
Yeah, no. Well, thanks for having me. And then also, yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing kind of like the mob of purple along the course. I'll probably be in Chicago covering the race. I'm no fall marathon running for me this year. And so yeah, I'll be in Chicago, be in New York, and it's always special because marathon weekends are the best. That's when you get a city just kind of everyone's all rallied around the same thing. You see
Yeah.
the people kind of day before the anticipation is building, and then on actual sort of race day, everyone's just supportive of everyone. And so we wish that was the case every single day,
Correct.
365 in every single city. But we get that definitely on marathon weekends.
I'll save a purple confetti popper for you in both Chicago and New York. If we see you come by on the course, we'll make sure to pop them for you. Give you some,
Oh,
give you some
perfect.
love. Chris, last thing here. Where's the best place for our audience watching and listening to kind of follow you guys along? I know we've mentioned a couple social channels, but where's the best place for people to do that, and as well as the podcast?
Yeah, so it's the City of Smack podcast. Publish it weekly. Sometimes there's 3 or 4 episodes in a week, at least once, at least one per week. It's an active sort of feed. And then just City of Smag across all different channels, whether that's Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. We pump out a lot of videos on YouTube, post-race interviews, athlete feature videos, workouts, all that kind of stuff is on there. We've got, newsletters, all that stuff you can find on cityofsmag.com as well.
Awesome. Chris, thank you for being a guest on the Project Purple podcast.
Thanks, Dino. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. If you liked today's episode, feel free to share this episode and make sure to follow the Project Purple podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening and be safe. That's a wrap of another episode of the Project Purple podcast.